Hello again, everybody. This is Derek, and I am coming back at you with another wargaming and miniature video. In today's video, we're going to continue on with our Land of the Free boot camp. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about melee combat. That's when you charge in, you get face to face, and you stick them with your bayonet or hit them with the butt of your musket. We've already talked about movement, orders, commanders, and the like. Be sure to go watch all of those videos. In the last video, we discussed shooting, and now we're going to go into melee combat. Now, the cheapest and often most effective weapon of the 18th and 19th century battlefields was the bayonet. It was heavily feared and highly respected because of the properly trained hands of soldiers. It redefined nations and created new countries. Melee combat will often produce faster results on the battlefield, but the risk of casualties increases as soldiers close with the enemy. A player may spend one maneuver order to declare a charge maneuver or counter-charge, depending on the situation. Regardless, if the action is a charge or counter-charge, the process for completing the order is the same. The player will measure to determine if the element has sufficient movement to complete the charge. When this measurement is made, players will double the normal movement of the element based on the formation that it is in when it declared the charge. The charge maneuver is broken up into 3 steps, consisting of the charging element's initial move, a pause in movement to allow the opposing player to react, followed by the final move into melee. Once an element has conducted a charge maneuver into contact with an enemy element, a melee combat must be conducted. The active player must spend one combat order to initiate a melee combat if they have any combat orders available. If the element has no combat orders to initiate a melee, then the charging element will suffer a disorder marker, and the elements will remain locked in melee until one of the elements in base contact is activated and issues a combat order to begin a melee. Whichever element is activated, the first must spend a combat action to initiate the melee. So you can actually charge into contact even if you don't have any combat orders remaining, but that is going to cause disruption on your unit. Okay, there's a sequence. There's a step-by-step breakdown of the procedures for conducting a normal charge and melee sequence. Special circumstances and interruptions, such as snapfire or countercharges, will be covered further below. Okay, here are the bullet points. The player declares a charge or countercharge maneuver with their element against the closest enemy element. The closest enemy element must be the most visible target within the charging element's threat zone. If there are one or more elements that satisfy these conditions, then the charging player may decide which element to target. If there are no enemy elements within the charging element's threat zone, then the charge may be declared against the closest and most visible enemy element within the charger's arc of sight. And we remember the arc of sight is 45 degrees from the ends of each side of the element. Rules. Artillery elements may never declare a charge. Elements in march column can never declare a charge. Elements may only charge enemy elements if they are smaller in size or one size larger than themselves. So tiny elements may only charge other tiny and small elements. Small elements may only charge small and medium and tiny. Medium and large elements may charge any sized element. So you can only charge up one size. The charging player measures the charge distance. To measure a successful charge, the player will measure from the leader of the charging element to the closest part of the intended target. If the target is within the charging element's movement, then a charge may be declared. Remember to double the movement for calculating a charge move. The charging element will begin its charge by conducting the initial movement toward the target. The charging element will rotate to place the target element's leader within the charging leader's threat zone. Okay. So, pretend it's like that. This leader's threat zone, if you remember, goes straight out from the leader's base. Right? Okay. And this element is within the unit's threat zone. So this unit would charge the closest element, this one. And the first thing that happens is this leader needs to rotate so that it's facing that leader. So leader on leader. The player controlling the target element will declare a charge reaction for the element that is being charged, which could be either hold, formation change, closing fire, countercharge, or withdrawal. The target element conducts its charger action with any results applied immediately to the affected element. As in that first example, right? You measure the range from here to there, and it looks like it's 5 inches, just like in the description. I would rotate and move 3 inches, which is half of my charge. So he moves 3 inches, leader facing the other leader, and this is when the target would make his declaration of reaction. And if there is no snap fire or counter charges declared by the opposing player, then the charging element will conduct its second movement, keeping the target leaders within the charging leader's threat zone until it comes into base contact with the target element during the second movement. The charging element does not wheel and move in a straight line towards the target element until it comes into contact. Then it halts its movement. The elements will maintain their facing, and neither element will realign itself to bring the stands flush against one another. So it's not a run up and then finagle yourself so that you're perfectly aligned. So this guy would charge in, making contact. The active element involved in the melee must spend a combat order to conduct a melee if the active element has a combat order available. If the active element does not have a combat order, then it will suffer a disorder. Once the combat order has been spent, both players will place a pool of dice next to each element representing the number of dice they will roll for the melee. Each element starts with 2 dice 6, and they will add their element's action dice and add or subtract dice based on the modifiers. So just like shooting, you start with a base of 2 dice, and then you add your action dice, which in this case, is 4 dice. So both sides will roll because of the size of the element and the fact that they are medium infantry and they get 4 action dice. So they have a total of 6 to begin with, and then they will modify that. The players will roll the number of dice in their modified melee action dice pool, and again, any results of 5 or better will result in a hit, just like shooting. Each player will then take the number of total hits they rolled and add in the combat results modifiers from the table below. The side with the higher result is declared the winner, and the other side is the loser. The losing element will turn directly away from the winning element and will withdraw en route 1 full maneuver for each point the element lost in combat. So if you lose by 3, then you would have 3 maneuvers to run away. Once the losing element has completed its move, the element will apply the hits it suffered in melee, as well as a disorder marker. If the number of hits is equal to or greater than the element's discipline, then the element will be required to take a discipline test, applying any appropriate modifiers. And if it fails the morale test, the element will conduct another withdrawal move en route step. If the losing element lost the melee combat resolution by a result greater than its discipline, then the element will lose an additional level of discipline. No morale test is required for losing a level of discipline. Okay, all of that so far makes sense. The winning side will apply any hits it has suffered in melee and receive a disorder marker. If the winning side suffers a number of hits equal to or greater than its discipline, then it will take a discipline morale test and apply the results immediately. If the winning side is the active element, so the one that charged in, and has not failed a discipline morale test, it will receive a free maneuver order as long as it is not in contact with any other enemy elements. This free maneuver order may be used to conduct any maneuver action legally available to the element. If the winning side's element withdraws because it failed its discipline morale test, then it does not receive the free maneuver for winning combat. So if you take enough casualties to cause a discipline morale test and you fail, you're going to withdraw. And if you withdraw, you don't get that free maneuver order. If the winning element is the active element and it has maneuver or combat orders remaining, including the free maneuver for winning, it may use them as normal, including conducting a new charge. So if this guy charges in, he rolls his dice, and after all the hits are applied and modified, if he wins and this guy retreats back, he's going to get a free move if he didn't take enough hits to cause a discipline and fail. And then he can decide, I'm going to charge. And at this point, he might charge the same element, or he might charge a new element. Do whatever you wish. If the element that won the melee is the active element, and it remains in contact with enemy elements, it may spend another combat order to initiate another melee. So I guess that means like if you charge and you actually made contact with a couple of different elements. Okay, let's talk about charge interruptions. At the end of the charging element's first movement, the opposing player may have elements in a position where they can perform a snap fire. If the element has a stored combat order, and the charging element ends its first maneuver within the element's threat zone, it may perform a snap fire. The element will perform the same procedures as conducting a shooting sequence, and if the charging element receives fire, then remove the snapfire token and replace it with a smoke marker. Okay, so hypothetically, what I'm planning on doing temporarily is marking a unit with a stored maneuver order with a blue and a stored combat order with a red. So hypothetically, let's say this unit had saved or stored a combat order from his last time that he was activated. And this guy declares a charge on him. And he moves his 3 inches and it gets him to right there. Well, now he can use that stored combat order to fire, and then we apply the smoke to show that he has unloaded muskets. If more than one element is performing a snap fire, then the player will pick one element at a time and apply the hits with any subsequent morale tests prior to conducting the next snap fire. So you do them one at a time. The order in which the snap fire is performed could play an important role in the outcome, since the results are applied immediately. So players want to be strategic if deciding which elements fire first. If the charging element survives the snap fire and does not withdraw, it may continue the second charge and move into contact with the target. If the charging element suffers enough hits, lowering its discipline status to shaken or exhausted, then it must follow the normal rules for shaken and exhausted elements. The charging element will require to evaluate whether or not the target element is eligible to be charged based on the condition of the charging element's discipline becoming shaken or exhausted. This could result in the element halting its charge after the first movement because it is no longer eligible to conduct the charge. Okay, countercharge. Let's say he had stored a maneuver. At the end of any of the active element's orders, or after the first charge movement, the opposing player may have elements in a position where they can perform a countercharge. If the active element completes an order or finishes the first charge move within the threat zone of an enemy element that has a stored maneuver order, and the active element is within a charge range, then the countercharge could be declared. A countercharge may only be conducted against an active element that is causing the element to react. All of the rules pertaining to declaring a charge apply to elements wishing to countercharge. Plus, there is an additional rule that pertains to element types. Infantry elements may only countercharge other infantry elements, and cavalry elements may countercharge against any type of element. So infantry cannot countercharge against cavalry. So the passive element will remove the stored maneuver order and announce the countercharge. The step-by-step process of declaring a charge and the actions to complete the charge are then performed. The active element will be able to declare a charge reaction against the countercharging element as long as it is not already engaged. Let's say the active element just moves, doesn't charge, it just moves and is now within its threat zone and is within 6 inches of this unit. let's say these guys just move up. At the end of his move, he can declare a countercharge. He can charge out against these guys, in which case he would make the 3-inch move, and if he has any moves or combat orders remaining, he could now use one to do a snap fire before he was able to actually finish his charge. So it kind of almost like reverses the role of the active element, because he's countercharging. Yes, the active element will now be able to declare a charge reaction against the countercharging element as long as it is not already used or is engaged. If the active element chooses to withdraw from a countercharge, the player will follow the process for withdrawing as a charge reaction, and then the element's activation will be immediately end. If multiple passive elements are eligible to declare a countercharge, then they are conducted one at a time, resolving each in turn before moving on to the next. Each countercharging element must be able to draw a line of sight to the active element and must be able to move into contact with the target element, following all the rules for charging. Combining snap fires and counter charges. If the passive player has multiple elements conducting both snap fires and counter charges, then the passive player must choose in which order the interruptions are processed. The snap fires adhere to all the normal shooting rules, including line of sight, friendly elements within the fire zone, and the inability to fire at enemy elements while engaged. The passive player will need to determine the order of the priority in which the elements will interrupt the active element's charge, taking into consideration the change in developments that have already influenced the charge move. Yeah, so if he countercharges and moves out here, he might block his shot, so maybe you want to shoot first before you countercharge. That kind of stuff. Okay, let's talk about these various charge reactions. We already kind of are, but now the rules are going to break each one down a little bit in detail. Okay, charging during this time period were very predictable unless the army was surprised or weather conditions such as fog prevented clear visibility. The soldiers would lower their bayonets, fixed muskets, often bellowing a mighty huzzah before methodically advancing towards the enemy lines. Not every nation subscribed to this procedure, but no matter what the ritual was, it gave time for the recipients of the charge to determine their course of action. Once the charging element was executed at first movement, the target element will announce its charge reaction and perform the actions required for the reaction. The target element must declare and perform one of these options. Formation change. A morale test is required in order to successfully change formation prior to the charging element moving into contact. If the element failed its morale test, it will be unable to make a formation change, and the element will receive a disorder marker. An element that already has at least one disorder marker cannot perform this order. Okay, so if you have any disorders, you can't perform a formation change. If the morale test is successful, the element will be able to conduct a formation change from the point where the charge distance was measured. The element will replace the stand that is closest to the charging element with the leader, and then the rest of the element will reform around the leader in whichever formation facing the player ordered. The target element is considered to be fighting in the new formation with all of the advantages and disadvantages that apply. If the formation change causes the element to interpenetrate friendly elements, then treat this element as the active element in purposes of resolving interpenetrations. There are no penalties or movement restrictions for this formation change. If the target element has stands placed in or behind scenery, if the formation change places the element into a position that takes advantage of scenery or defenses, then they will receive the bonuses in melee. As an example, just hypothetically, if he's in march column and he declares a charge and he makes his morale check, you would maybe switch to battle line and fight as if you're in battle line if you succeed in your formation change. Okay, another one is called closing fire. If the target element has loaded weapons and the charging element is within the target's arc of sight, then it may declare a closing fire. Conduct a normal shooting sequence and apply the results immediately to the charging element before it completes its second charge movement. If the charging element suffers a number of hits equal to or greater than its discipline, then it must successfully pass a discipline morale test to finish its charge move. If the discipline morale test is failed, the charging element will be forced to withdraw and will end its activation after it conducts its withdrawal. Right. So if he moves in, the guy snap fires, like he takes his half move, moves up, he takes his snap fire, right? He removes his stored combat order and causes this guy enough hits that he has to make a morale test, and then he does, and if he fails, he withdraws according to the withdrawal rules and doesn't complete the charge. Countercharge. If the charging element is within the target element's threat zone and within charge range of the target element, then it may declare a countercharge reaction. Infantry elements may declare countercharge against infantry, and cavalry elements may declare a countercharge against infantry or cavalry, conducting a countercharge. Elements must be able to legally declare a charge in order to countercharge, which includes line of sight and discipline requirements before the countercharge is declared. For example, if a shaken element intends on countercharging and fails its morale test, it will be unable to conduct the countercharge. Infantry elements may issue a countercharge against other infantry elements if one of the following conditions applies. The infantry element has stored maneuver orders, and an infantry element ends an order within its charge move inside its threat zone. The infantry element is the target of the charge and elects to countercharge as a charge reaction. Okay, cavalry elements may issue a countercharge against infantry and other cavalry elements if one of the following conditions apply. The cavalry element has a stored maneuver order, and an enemy ends its order inside its threat zone. The cavalry element is the target of the charge and selects a countercharge as a charge reaction. Having read this, it sounds like if you are the target of the charge, you don't have to have a maneuver. You can countercharge. But let's say he's over here. And this guy declares a charge here, right? He takes his first half of his move. Now, because he's the target of the charge, he can declare a countercharge without a stored order. But because he's not the target of the charge, it would require him to have a maneuver order stored to conduct the countercharge. Because it says only one of the following conditions must apply. A, the infantry element has a stored maneuver order and an infantry element ends an order or its first charge move inside its threat zone and within 6 inches. Okay. B, the infantry element is the target of the charge and elects to countercharge as a charge reaction. Yeah, once the charging element has executed its first movement, the target element will announce its charge reaction and perform the actions required for the reaction. And it says the target element must declare and perform one of these options: formation change, closing fire. So that must mean he gets a free shot. It's not a snap fire. Counter charge, which we're still reading, hold, carry on, and withdraw. Okay, so let's continue with the counter charge. A counter charge may only be directed towards the active element. The sequence of events to complete a counter charge is the following. The active element has executed its first charge move, or it has ended an order within a passive element's threat zone. The passive player declares a countercharge with the target element first, then with any elements that have the active element within their threat zone and a stored maneuver order. Yeah, so the target of the charge doesn't have to have a stored order. Okay. C. Select a counter-charging element, and it will move exactly like a charging element's initial move in accordance with the normal charge rules above. The active element will announce charge reactions against any elements spending a maneuver order to perform a countercharge. As long as the active element is unengaged and the active element's charge reactions are resolved one at a time as each countercharge is declared, the active element receives no charge reactions against the target element if it countercharges, since melee against the element was the original goal. Okay. Now, remember, if I move like I'm charging them, and I move up, and he decides to use closing fire and fires, this guy can now declare, because he's got a stored movement, he can declare a countercharge against him. Okay. If the non-target, this unit, gets involved by declaring a countercharge, now he can declare a charge reaction, like maybe change formation or snap fire, or I guess it's closing fire, or something like that. Hold or withdraw. But if he decides to countercharge, then he cannot perform a reaction because that was the original intent. Countercharging artillery. Since artillery cannot declare charges, there is no instance when a countercharge can be declared against them. Hold. The target element will just remain stationary, not do anything. Carry on. The charging element that has been countercharged elects to continue completing its charge move. Remember, this guy declares a countercharge because he's got a maneuver order stored. So that gives him a reaction. His reaction is continuing on. So he would continue on, and then he would charge in. Okay. Withdrawal. If the element's charge response is to withdraw for an attempted charge or countercharge, then the element will retire in route step directly away from the charging or countercharging element. If the target element's withdrawal move takes the element outside of the charging element's second charge, then the active element must find a fresh enemy. So basically, he can make the second half of his charge, but it has to be to a new enemy. If the charging element decides to withdraw and moves outside the counter-charging element's second charge move measurement, then the countercharge is a failure. The counter-charging element will not perform its second move, and the active element's activation will end immediately. Withdraw move. An element that declares a withdraw as a charge reaction may conduct a number of maneuvers equal to the die roll that is the same as their group commander's CP roll. For example, if an element is attempting to withdraw and has a skilled group commander, so the element would normally roll 2d3 and pick the highest. Yeah, looking on the command points for a skilled commander, it's normally 2d3 and you pick the highest. And that is not the inches, that's the number of maneuvers. All fit elements will add +1 to the results, representing the level of readiness and the ability to react quickly. The player may utilize any or all the maneuvers to avoid the charge, but the movement must take the element directly away from the charging element. If the withdrawing element fails to move outside of the element's second charge move, then the withdrawing element will suffer a disorder marker and receive the charge as if it was issued a hold order. The withdrawing element will complete its move before determining if the second charge move is in range or not. Okay, so a normal move is 3 inches, but a charge move is 6 inches. So I can see where it might catch you, but probably not. If the withdrawing element, okay, fresh enemy. If the withdrawing element moves outside of the charging element's second charge move, or the withdrawing element moves in such a way that friendly elements block the successful completion of the charge, then the charging element must redirect into a new valid target element. The new target element will be able to declare a charge reaction, as this redirection comes as a complete surprise. The active element will use its second charge movement in an attempt to contact a fresh enemy. If there is no valid target, then the active element will not use its second charge move, but will be able to use its remaining maneuver and combat orders per the normal rules. So if it has another maneuver order, it could use it to declare a new charge. So this is giving me flashbacks to Magic the Gathering. Not that I played a lot of Magic the Gathering, but I know that in the tournament world, there were instances when players would say a reaction is faster than an instant is faster than a reaction, and an interrupt is faster than a reaction, which is faster than an instant. And basically, there was a lot of timing issues. It was well resolved in the rules. But this gives me the impression that you declare a charge, you move your 3 inches, which is half of your 6, and then your opponent takes it upon himself to do a charge reaction. He can shoot, he can move, countercharge, he can hold, he can change formation with any of his elements that are eligible. So he could have multiple actions, almost like taking the initiative into their own hands, which might cause the original charging element to react to the reacting infantry. He declares a charge against, let's say, again, this guy's over here. He's got stored maneuver. This guy charges. He only gets half his move, so he's there. This guy declares to shoot. He shoots. And then he declares to use his order to countercharge. And by doing so, he would move half his movement, right? 3 inches, at which point it would fall back upon the original to get a charge reaction to him, and he could withdraw, he could stand and fire, but he has to react to the element causing the reaction. Let's say he withdraws and he falls back a number of maneuvers. Now, because he can't complete the order, he has to stop. That's pretty interesting. Okay. Wow. So I'm foreseeing that it can go back and forth a little bit depending on what you've got stored and who's positioned in the right way. That's going to become very important. After all of the who is charging who, now we have to figure out how. So we're going to do conducting a melee. Once the elements have moved into contact with one another, boom, like so, and the active player has spent a combat order, then both sides will create an action dice pool, like we talked about originally. You get 2 dice, and then you get your action dice, plus any modifiers that apply below, according to this chart right here. Once the dice pools have been established, you roll your dice, and you're looking for 5s and 6s. Okay, so what do we got? Initiated the melee. Used the combat order. Wow. Okay, so if I initiate the charge, I get 2 extra dice. If you're fighting melee in battle line, that's this. You get an extra 2 dice. Wow, that's going to be a lot of dice. If you're fighting the enemy in the flank, which they're not, you would get an extra 2 dice. If you countercharged, you get 1 die. And then for every disorder marker, you get -1. If you're exhausted, you get -1. Elements in support and elements in close support. Elements in support give you half a die, and elements in close support give you a full die. And we'll go into what's in support and what's not. After all the combat action dice have been rolled and the hits have been determined, both sides will add their resolution modifiers from below, this new chart, versus the difference in casualties. The players will compare the values, and whoever has the highest will win. Okay, if you're fighting artillery or march column, it says unlimbered, but that's got to be artillery. I would think it would be limbered or march column, but, hey, you get a +2. Battle line versus an open order, you get +1. So you get an advantage against somebody that's in open order. And then for every successful hit, you get a +1. So basically, that's just comparing the two casualties. Flank gets +2. Fit versus exhausted gets +2. Fit versus shaken gets a +1. If your element is within the sphere of influence of your group, you get a +1. If your commander is attached, you get a +1. And if you occupy a defense, you get a +2. And if you occupy high ground, you get a +1. Okay, so the melee results are not extra casualties. That's just a chart to determine who has the most influence on the fight. If the numbers tie, if they're both the same, then it's a tie. Both sides suffer a disorder marker, and there are 3 possible outcomes. 1. If one or both elements suffered a number of hits equal to or greater than their discipline level, they would require a discipline morale test. If one or both of the elements fail their morale test, they will flee in route step directly away from the element they were in melee with. If the elements pass the morale test, they will remain in melee. If both elements remain locked in melee, then the active element must spend another combat order to initiate another round of melee. Both players will need to reevaluate their melee modifiers and combat results modifiers because the previous melee may have altered the results. If both elements remain locked in melee, but the active element does not have any more combat orders, then the elements will remain in melee until one of the elements is activated. The first element that is activated must spend a combat order to initiate the melee. The active element does not receive any disorder markers if it cannot sustain a melee after the initial charge. Okay, so if you initially charge in without any combat orders, then you receive a disorder and you wait. But if you had a combat order when you charged in and you spent it and you made all the die rolls and it wound up being a tie and you ran out of combat orders, then you don't have to worry about becoming disordered because you did successfully have at least one combat order. Artillery in melee. Unlimbered artillery engaged in melee. An unlimbered artillery element may only hold or perform a closing fire as a charge reaction. The unlimbered artillery element will fight in melee, but if it loses the element, it is shattered and removed from play. So artillery that lose melee don't withdraw, they just get destroyed. The charging element is considered to be the winner. Yeah, I would think so. If the artillery element wins or ties the melee, it will suffer a disorder and apply its hits with any subsequent discipline morale tests. Unlimbered artillery does not withdraw when it fails a discipline morale test, but it will downgrade a level of discipline. Yeah, that's normal. Okay, limbered artillery, the target of a charge. Limbered artillery must withdraw if they are the target of a charge. If a limbered artillery element fails to withdraw outside of the second charge move of the charging element, then move the charging element into base contact per the normal charge rules. Once the charging element spends a combat action to begin the melee, the limbered artillery element is automatically shattered and removed from play. So if you're able to conduct a charge against a limbered artillery and you have a combat order, you automatically destroy them. The charging element is considered to have won the melee, is issued a disorder marker, and awarded a free maneuver action per the normal rules of winning a melee. There's a handful of special situations or special rules. Let's go over those real quick. Melee combats engage for more than one round. Elements starting a new turn already engaged in melee must spend a combat order to conduct a melee. Only the active element may spend a combat order to initiate a melee. Okay, we knew that. Elements charging into melee with friendly and enemy elements. Elements already engaged in a melee have no opportunity for a charge reaction and will automatically receive the new charge. Elements maneuvering into an existing melee may not shoot into the melee prior to charging. Yeah, because you're not allowed to shoot into a melee. Elements supporting a melee. Here we go. The linear warfare during the Age of Musket required that units support each other to prevent the enemy from turning its flank. Formed regiments would often mutually support one another as they engaged the enemy on the battlefield. This system of support would boost morale and provide assistance to any unit that's fighting in melee. When a combat order is used to initiate a melee, both players may decide to involve other elements that are supporting the melee. An element in melee may be supported by up to 3 elements, as long as they are within the flank and within 6 inches of the leader of the element in melee. A supporting element will add half of its action dice. Oh, okay. Not half a die, but half of its action dice. So like if he is supporting him, instead of giving him 4 dice, he'll give him 2 dice. Half of his action dice. Okay, I get you now. Adding or subtracting any modifiers that may apply to the element. The supporting element's dice are added to the overall action dice pool for fighting in the melee. If there are supporting elements that have any portion of their bases within 1 inch or within the threat zone of an enemy element in melee, then the element must support the melee. If this is less than 1 inch, they must support the melee. This guy is more than 1 inch. If there are any supporting elements that have any portion of their bases within 1 inch or within the threat zone of the enemy element in melee, it must support. Okay, he's within the threat zone. Under these conditions, the supporting element will give all of its action dice, adding and subtracting any melee modifiers in support. Okay, so he's close support, right? Would give all 4. And I say close because he's within the threat zone. Or if this is within 1 inch, he would also be close support. So support is 6 inches, close support is 1 inch or threat zone. This is commonly referred to as close support. Elements that occupy a building cannot be supported in melee, even if there are other friendly elements occupying the same building. On the other hand, an element that is not occupying a building may be supported by an element occupying a building. The buildings can give support, they cannot receive support. Elements in march column, artillery that are limbered, or elements that are exhausted can never give support. Yeah, exhausted is 1 step away from being eliminated. Elements that support the main melee will be required to withdraw along with the element fighting in melee if their side loses. They will withdraw following the same rules as the element involved in melee. Okay, so it's like they're all involved. Every supporting element involved in a melee that was on the losing side will suffer one hit. The hits will be applied once the element has withdrawn, and any subsequent discipline morale test will be taken after completing the withdrawal move. Okay, so if you're going to support with them, there's a possibility that they might also suffer from that melee. The last piece is multiple elements in base-to-base contact. If there are multiple enemy elements in melee, let's say he's here, he's there, he's there. So now there's multiple elements in melee. The active element must spend a combat order to initiate a melee. The active player will select which enemy element to fight in melee, and the remaining enemy elements in contact will provide close support for the combat. Okay, so that's implying that he charged and he touched two of them. So he decides that he's going to be the one that gets the full brunt of the melee, and he would automatically be in support. Close support in this case. So it wouldn't be possible the other way around. Because hypothetically, let's say situations like this guy charges in, conducts a melee. The only way it can remain this way is if he ties and they both pass all the morale tests and everything. And if they tie and he runs out of combat orders, so that element's actions are done, then he decides that he's going to charge in, and which he could do, and then he would have to spend a combat order to initiate a melee. He would be the active element, but he would also still be in support. Yes, it doesn't say that he doesn't get to provide support because he's already engaged in a melee. So he basically would get 2 for 1. You get a second support element. Yeah, I don't know. That seems a little overbalanced. I might have to adjust those rules personally. Yeah, the rules do not limit him from declaring a charge, conducting a melee, and then if everything resolves, him charging, them conducting another melee with him in support. I know the support, if he charges in, this element would be considered in support. It's more than an inch, so he would lend in half of his combat dice to fight. But once this guy charges in and engage, now this guy would get to supply 4 dice. So it's almost like you're getting a bunch of extra dice by charging with 2, which I guess would overwhelm this unit and they would get eliminated most likely or have to withdraw. Alright, well that was Melee for Land of the Free. Kind of a little bit that you got to wrap your head around, but we figured it out. Alright, and that's where we're going to end this video. Now in the next video, we're going to be talking about discipline and morale for our units and how it affects them. Alright, so I will see you in the next boot camp video for Land of the Free. Catch you next one.